In 1867, so 151 years ago, the leaders of the Fenian Uprising against British rule in Ireland issued a Proclamation of Independence, which is a bit less known than its what followed it in 1916, but I think is an awful lot better in a lot of ways. One of the things it called for was, to quote, absolute liberty of conscience and complete separation of church and state. So it went quite a bit further than what came in 1916. 151 years ago, Republicans were calling for a secular state in Ireland, and here we are. At different points, Republicans have allied themselves to the Catholic Church, while others felt from the beginning that secularism was one of the fundamental characteristics of a republic and one of the fundamental characteristics of a socialist republic. Why do we think it's so important? You'll see on most of the Workers' Party's documents the words socialist and secular are written. If you ask most people what kind of a party the Workers' Party is, they'd probably say socialist, and less might think of the word secular. And I wonder, I suppose it's important to think, why is it that the party and socialists give secularism quite as much of an emphasis as they do? It's not really because we hate religion, or because even that we think that we recognise the abuses that the church has carried out over the years, although those were many, and some of the speakers have already mentioned them. More importantly, the importance we place on secularism is a bit more fundamental, and it's really because other than the state itself, no other institution has really reached such a scale of size and power that it could actually step into the role of providing large-scale public services. Its scale and orientation towards providing these services means that historically, in many ways, it's actually acted like a parallel state. And for that reason, anybody whose objective is to enhance the relationship, the really important democratic link between citizens and their state, anybody who thinks that's important also views removing that power that the church holds to act as a parallel service provider is important. So that's why other states like Italy and France, as they became republics, placed such an emphasis on removing the church's power in earlier centuries. And that was never something that was fully done in Ireland. And really that's why we start this conversation today. Often we think about, you'll have the likes of Simon Harris and Leo Varadkar saying that the idea of taking compulsory ownership of church property is too radical. But the only reason that we're left in a situation of having to do it today is because most other countries did it centuries ago. And it's not really a good enough excuse for us to not do it, simply that we didn't get around to it then. So just how widespread is church control of our public services? Most people are probably familiar with the statistics around schools. 90% of primary schools, the patron is the Catholic Church, and another 6% the patron is some other form of religious body. So only 4% of schools are without a religious patron. That compares with 10% in Sweden at the lower end of the scale in Europe, up to about 60% in the Netherlands, which I was quite surprised by, but it's still quite a distance behind the Irish figures. There's nowhere else that even comes close. 50% of schools, secondary schools, don't have a religious patron, while the remainder, a good chunk of them, share management between a religious body and another body. So even there, a majority still have religious involvement. And I think even more concerningly, in teacher training colleges, there's also a huge scale of religious involvement. There's very, very limited options for somebody who wants to go on to be a teacher and doesn't want religious indoctrination to be a core part of how they learn to teach other young people. So Mary Immaculate College, for example, in its constitution says that one of its commitments is to preserve, protect and support the college's denominational status. So its status as a Catholic teaching college is really critical to how it views itself. And as many people know and others have mentioned, since the establishment of the form of patronage and pluralism in 2011, only 10 schools have actually been divested. So those statistics have remained pretty constant, even though the debate has moved on to a point of us thinking that this is something that's become part of the mainstream agenda. I think sometimes we can be somewhat misled by the number of our friends or family members whose kids might have the option of going to an Educate Together. It's not reflective of the vast majority of parents' choices or of the vast majority of children's experiences. So in hospitals, I think, apart from the National Maternity Hospital, much less is discussed in the public realm in media debates about the level of religious involvement in our hospital system. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so great that Marie has put considerable time into kind of breaking down the detail of religious ownership. A large majority of voluntary hospitals in the state have some religious involvement. It's not immediately apparent in many cases. It's not that they're owned or managed directly by a religious order, but their governance codes would provide for things like Marie was mentioning, the Archbishop on a board, or some form of religious involvement by law in the governance of the hospital. 6 acute hospitals are completely owned by either the Sisters of Mercy or the Sisters of Charity. I won't go over what Marie mentioned, but just to give you some of the figures in terms of public money that's being given to those. One of the most stark, I think, demonstrations of the scale of state funding to these religious hospitals is that the Sisters of Mercy and the Sisters of Charity over the past 10 years have received a total of €4 billion from the state to manage their hospitals. That is extremely large amounts of public money going into entirely private religious institutions that don't have any clear responsibility to follow state direction on how they manage their hospitals. Some other examples, hospitals that I wouldn't even be familiar with, the Kappa Orthopaedic Hospital received 34 million from the state. It's owned by one of those two orders. The Mater received 268 million, the Mercy in Cork 82 million, St Vincent's 256 million, St Michael's in Cllr 27 million. That's all just in 2017. The Sisters of Mercy's healthcare company owns a total of €637 million worth of property and assets. A significant amount of that would be private hospitals, but that amount of money would also include the Mater, the Mercy Hospital in Cork, and Temple Street Children's Hospital. So its assets, its land and its property is valued at €637 million. All of that is fully owned by a religious orders company, and in its constitution it says very clearly that if that company is wound up, those assets would be transferred in the first instance to another Catholic organisation, or if that's not possible, to the Archbishop of Dublin. So it is very, very clear that all of those assets ultimately come back to the Archbishop of Dublin if the company is wound up. And in 2017, apart from just the money we gave to the running of that hospital, we actually granted the company that runs that group €4 million in capital funding. So that was €4 million to improve buildings which we do not own, and which, if the company is wound up, will go back to a religious organisation. And that's, apart from anything else, just an astoundingly bad use of public money. To be investing money in buildings that we have no control over how they will be used in the future is just extremely bad financial management, apart from anything else. And finally, Temple Street Children's Hospital received €105 million from the HSE in 2017, and its governing code, according to its website, I quote, says, "We pledge ourselves to reverence the dignity of human life at every level of its existence, believing that every person is made in the image of God." I think there's two things that concern me. I suppose it's a little difficult. Yeah, it's difficult to talk about because Temple Street is a hospital that many people feel a huge affinity to, and I think it's really important to make that clear. None of this is running down the phenomenal work being done in places like Temple Street Children's Hospital, and I'm sure there are people who would view that sentence as kind of affirming in some way. I think for many people who went through the referendum campaign, the Catholic Church's view of the dignity of human life at every level of its existence is concerning. And I think secondly, a scientific institution like a hospital talking about the image of God on its website, it's just inappropriate, and it's really incredible that so few people, I think, know about it. So this is important. Again, it's not just because we dislike religion. We don't. People are entitled to their religion. It's important because it has real impact on the delivery of healthcare. So some examples, historically in 2005 the Mater Hospital stopped a public patient from being involved in a cancer research trial because it would require, it wasn't safe for women who were pregnant, and as a result the woman in question would be required to take a contraceptive to ensure she wasn't pregnant. So the Mater stopped her engagement in the trial. Eventually, after a lot of rigmarole, the Fine Gael response to this would be, yeah, but we got around that, it was fine, she was able to do the trial. First of all, she was able to do it because she agreed to abstinence, so some sort of a Catholic friendly workaround was arrived at. But second of all, it's concerning that for a decision as basic as a patient's participation in a research trial, you have to go through 3 different hoops at a board to have that signed off on. And that's the real question mark around these hospitals. There's clear differences around issues like abortion that we're now aware of, and we can almost write into law. I don't think that's going to happen very successfully, but potentially we could write in exactly how those are dealt with. But down the line, more and more discoveries are being made in areas like genetics, like stem cell research, which don't have anything to do with reproductive care, but where the Catholic Church is only now starting to actually formulate its own view on these issues. And it might very well decide that many of them are things that are incompatible with church teaching. And the best case scenario is that every patients who are in dire need of these kinds of treatments will have to take cases, fight cases. The board will have to go into conversation with the minister. Somebody will have to ask a bishop to step down from a board. They'll appoint somebody else. And in the meantime, the patient is left waiting for vitally needed treatment. So I don't think that it's just not correct to say that ethos doesn't have an impact on the delivery of healthcare in our hospitals. And the second practical reason, apart from anybody's attitude towards religion, that this is important is because fundamentally we have no real control over the future use of our hospitals. We have no real bottom line say in how these buildings are used down the line. A school, it's more easy to see how we can say, grand, they can have their school and we'll build another one over here. The idea of replicating St. Vincent's Hospital in another place is just astoundingly expensive and difficult. It's not practical. So a very, very small example of how little control we have over these assets is that in 2007, St. Michael's in Dunleary transferred from, correct me if I'm wrong, I get these mixed up, from the Sisters of Mercy to the Sisters of Charity. No, it was the other way around. It was sold by the Sisters of Charity to the Sisters of Mercy. And there was a car park next to it, which was empty land, and it was understood for the good functioning of the hospital, it would be good to be able to use that car park down the line in order to expand the hospital and modernise it. But the Sisters of Charity, who continued to own the car park, decided to sell it to a private developer for housing instead. And it completely inhibited the ability of that hospital to improve itself, to expand and to do its good work. This is a hospital which is 100% funded by the state, including all of the capital improvements, all of the building improvements that have been done. So we have no real ability to say, to guarantee that a hospital, for example, St. Vincent's Healthcare Group has been expanding its private healthcare provision. The hospital under planning has to remain as a hospital. It can't be changed into like apartments. But it doesn't have to remain as a public hospital. It could easily be changed into a private hospital if St. Vincent's Healthcare Group decided that that was the right thing to do. And overnight, one of our major public hospitals would no longer be available to taxpayers, despite having been funded to the scale that it has over so many years. So it has a real impact. And I guess the other thing that the Leo-liberals, I like that phrase, the Leo-liberals would respond with is, that's all well and good, but we've done more than anybody on the left ever has to make our society secular. We repealed the 8th Amendment, we brought in gay marriage, we're divesting the schools. They'd list out all the ways that they practically are doing anything. The reality is that in relation to hospitals, for example, there has been no shift in policy whatsoever. A number of small voluntary hospitals have transferred from a religious to a state ownership, but that was really for local factors. It wasn't because of a state policy that we don't want hospitals to be under religious control. And actually the National Maternity Hospital decision really shows that if anything we're going backwards. In relation to education, as is well known, only 10 schools have been divested. But I think more importantly than that, the way in which the divestment is being managed is really problematic. So it's basically based around the idea that whatever the demographic makeup in an area is, that's what the school division should be. So if you have 60% Muslims, you have 60% of schools places in Muslim schools. If you have 20% atheists, you have 20% of places for atheists. It's simply impractical. It completely ignores the fact that our demographics shift over time, and that we might know that 50% of people want to send their kids to a non-religious school now, but it completely ignores the fact that that will likely increase dramatically over time. It also, and I think this has been improved recently, but over the last number of years, like as a counsellor, I'm sure Cllr is the same, when a new school is being set up, parents establish competing campaigns to try and get the kind of school that they want to send their kids to in an area. So you have one group of parents who want a Catholic school, another group want an Educate Together, another group want a Gael school, and they're being encouraged to actively campaign against each other for the kind of school in their neighbourhood. That's a really unhealthy approach to establishing our schools, and it comes directly from the model of secularisation that the state has put in place under the Fine Gael Labour government in 2011. And I think finally, most concerningly in relation to education, the model completely segregates children as it's currently being implemented. And that's the fundamental point of disagreement that we have in relation to educational policy. We believe that it should be one single universal system of education, and anything else should be a private matter, privately funded. So, and I guess what this brings us on to is what's the missing link? You know, if the government has been going around trying to secularise everything for so long and it's failing, what's the link? And I suppose from my point of view, the basic, and from the workers' point of view, party's point of view, the missing link is the fact that the government has resolutely refused to consider actually taking these institutions into full state ownership. So in 2017, Fine Gael altered government policy so that the divestment would take place not just where an existing school was closing, but through negotiation with a local patron or owner. And when Minister for Education Richard Bruton was announcing the policy, he noted that a number of lessons had been learned from how the divestment policy so far had failed. And one of the important lessons that he learned was, first of all, the importance of working with the current landowner, that is the bishop, and recognising that a lease arrangement from the current landowner to the new patron would remove the need for complicated property transfers. Do you have to go, Cllr? No problem. Really thanks a million for coming. It's fine.
I've been watching the rest of it online. I'm so sorry. I feel so bad because it was so good. So just
no worries.
Me and
thanks a million, Cllr. So, so basically, Richard Bruton fully basically decided, look, it's too hard trying to get the schools off the bishop, so we should just move to leasing them from them instead. So that was a major change in policy that has been barely reported. And in practice, what it did was to reduce the state to a junior partner who's just negotiating with a landowner. And if anybody's ever tried to negotiate with their landlord, it doesn't give you an awful lot of cards to play. So basically now, in terms of getting schools from the church into state ownership, the state has said 100%, we're just going to ask the bishops if they wouldn't mind us leasing the schools for a while. One example that I know of, one of the 10 schools that was divested, there was only... They were given a 10-year lease, which is now coming to an end, and the church has not, under any circumstances, said that it will actually be renewing the lease. So the students in the school are left without any certainty about their future. So what would make a difference? Basically deciding that instead of all of these complicated rigmarole arrangements, we would tackle the problem head on and go about taking schools and hospitals into public ownership. It's not something that's particularly straightforward. The first thing that would be required is a referendum to remove the clause in the Constitution which grants the church particular property rights. We think that would be the simplest way to go about it. Instead of risking High Court challenges down the line, I would be fairly sure that would pass without much of a problem, and I can't see any reason why the church, or anybody for that matter, but in this instance the church, should have property rights ingrained in the Constitution. The second thing that we would need is a full transparency about what the church actually owns. This is something that's not at all clear at the moment. The accounts and the way that the church and all of its entities manage themselves is really similar to a very complex, well-managed, well-financed multinational corporation. So even though the Sisters of Charity as an order owe millions to the state, billions I think, they're also the sole owners of a healthcare company which legally is completely separate from them. And so that company, even though it has significant assets, can't be pursued for any of the money that the Sisters of Charity actually owe the state. This is really similar to how companies get around avoiding paying their tax bills. They set up another company, all the money is in one company and all of the tax liabilities is in another, and that's exactly how these entities are working. But even though, so the church will tell us that St. Vincent's Hospital Group, the Mater Hospital Group, the local parish, that all of these are financially autonomous, that they're all governed separately. But when you actually examine the constitution of each of these, it's clear that if the company is wound up, all of the assets always transfer back to the Archbishop's diocese in the form of the St. Lawrence O'Toole Trust. So it has set up a model of small agencies that look like they're not very significant, and it's never clear exactly. I suppose it gives an image of decentralisation when in fact when you drill down into them, all of the assets that are owned are effectively under the control of one single entity. But interestingly, when you look at the accounts of that trust that ultimately owns all of those assets, none of them are listed there. So basically you can see my frustration from months of trying to figure it out. It's almost impossible to figure out exactly what the church owns in its totality. And the onus shouldn't be on us to do that. These are organisations that are fully publicly funded. So one of the basic prerequisites to doing any of this is that the church produces a full list of assets, first of all stating what's worth what, and second of all stating the total cumulative public funding in terms of land donations, capital grants and annual current funding that each of the assets owned by the church has been given, so that we have a full sense of how exactly these entities have been funded and where they got the land from in the first place. And then finally, we would have to, and then we think that any of those entities that has been funded over its lifetime more than 50% by the state should be immediately taken into state ownership. The rest of them we think we should then begin to, that's kind of an arbitrary figure which we could move around, but in order to move things quickly, that's I think the bottom line. If something has been more than 50% funded by the state over its lifetime, absolutely it should be taken into immediate public ownership. In terms of the cost of doing that, one thing that's really important to remember is that all of these organisations are zoned for the function that they hold. So a school is zoned to be a school. It's not very valuable to anybody as long as it's zoned to be a school. And so the real cost of actually acquiring these, if you had to pay for them, shouldn't really be excessive. It certainly shouldn't be such a waste of money as we're spending on them at the moment when we have no control over them. So just a final bit of information that I came across that I think is interesting to conclude things. The Donny Carney, which is one of the more successful and best known examples of large scale public housing built in Ireland. I think I was thinking a lot about where did this land come from, how did we come to own the land that public housing was built on originally, and it turns out that the land of Donny Carney was originally part of a monastery which Henry VIII dissolved, not because he was very secular, just because he didn't like Irish Catholic monasteries very much. He dissolved it and the land was then donated to Dublin City Corporation and used to build public housing on. That was in the 16th century. So 500 years ago it was commonplace for a government to recognise that the land owned by a monastery could easily be taken into public ownership and used for the public good. Now I'm simplifying slightly, but today we have a situation where the Archbishop of Dublin is selling a piece of land which I think is enough to build around 700 homes in Drumcondra for commercial and private development in Drumcondra, and so we've gone backwards basically. And I guess what we're saying is that along the same lines as what Claire has said, we're never going to have a better opportunity than now to start pushing for these kinds of changes. Thank you.